It slipped out from between the pages of a cookbook Claire hadn't opened since her mother died. A small folded note, creased and weathered like it had been held too tightly, too often. The paper smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper. It simply read, "I'm still here, but no one's asked." She had written it once, in the quiet of a December night, sitting in the kitchen where the light buzzed softly and the kettle had long gone cold. That winter, everyone talked at her about parties, new jobs, divorces, their children's bright futures. But no one asked about hers, and so she smiled and nodded and sent the emoji that laughed. Now, years later, she read that line and wondered, how many women have folded away their pain so neatly no one ever noticed the weight? And how many are still waiting for someone, anyone, to ask, "Are you okay?" Claire Whitmore lived in the kind of town where the post office still closed for lunch and people greeted each other by name in the grocery aisle. Maple Falls was wrapped in red leaves for most of October, then surrendered quietly to the long gray hush of winter. Her bookstore sat at the corner of Main and Willow, a narrow shop with a crooked sign and a bell that chimed whenever someone pushed the door open. Inside, the scent of old pages and bergamot tea lingered in the air, and a space heater hummed beneath the front counter where Claire spent most of her days. She was 48, divorced, and had been living alone since her daughter left for college. Most days she didn't mind the quiet. She watered the peace lily in the window, made lists she rarely finished, and remembered to refill the candy jar for Mrs. Delaney, the widow who came in every Tuesday to browse through mystery novels she'd already read. People thought Claire was doing well. She smiled when spoken to, asked about everyone's children, and remembered birthdays others forgot. But no one ever asked about her. There had been a time, 6 years ago, maybe 7, when she and Sam talked every day. He'd show up unannounced, carrying his favorite lemon scones, or sit on her couch late into the evening, venting about his ex-wife or asking for advice he'd never follow. She used to think it was enough, that being needed counted as connection. But the year her mother died, no one came. Sam didn't. Not even a text. And Claire learned then how easily a person can disappear from their own life without anyone noticing. Now, the apartment above her shop felt more like a waiting room than a home. There were books stacked on every surface, half-written letters, tucked inside cookbooks, and silence so complete it sometimes startled her when the kettle boiled. Still, she showed up, every day, for the customers, for the shelves, for the illusion of a life being lived, and maybe, she thought, if she kept listening long enough, someone might finally notice the sound of her not speaking. It started with something simple, as most heartaches do. Claire had gone looking for chamomile, one of the last tea bags her mother had packed into that old wooden box with the carved lid, and instead found the folded paper again. She hadn't seen it in years, though she remembered the way it felt, against her fingertips before she unfolded it. Fragile, softened at the edges, almost like skin. It had no date, no name. Just that one line written in her own hand, shaky and slanted. "I'm still here, but no one's asked." She stood by, the window, the half-filled kettle forgotten on the stove, and let the silence grow until it filled the entire room. Outside, the snow had begun to fall. Soft, hesitant flakes swirling over the red bricks of Maple Falls. It was the kind of evening made for soup and old movies, for laughter and socks with holes in the heel, for the kind of warmth Claire used, to imagine would find her if she just waited long enough. But instead, it was always this. Quiet so deep it seemed to echo. That winter, 2 years ago now, was the worst one. Her mother had died in November, and Claire, being Claire, had kept the news quiet. She told Ella, of course, and the funeral had been small, but she didn't post anything. She didn't want casseroles or condolences or someone telling her how their mother died too. She just wanted someone, anyone, to notice. But no one did. No one called. No one stopped by. Sam didn't text, not even to ask about the Christmas lights they used to put up together. For weeks, Claire sat in that apartment above the shop, watching snow fall on a town that had forgotten her. And yet, she still opened the store each morning. She still tied the red ribbon on the bookstore cat, still brewed the spiced tea the regulars loved, still wrapped gift books with too much care for strangers who didn't know her last name. People said she was kind, resilient, the heart of Maple Falls. And perhaps that was the most painful thing, that she had been present for everyone and yet entirely invisible. There had been one night, during that long, dark winter, when the silence pressed so heavily against her chest that she reached for her phone without thinking. It was late, well past 2. The town was sleeping, even the snow seemed still. Claire began typing, her thumbs trembling as the words poured out. How she missed her mother's humming while cooking, how she hadn't spoken to another soul in days, how scared she was of the quiet growing inside her like a second skin. She wrote about the ache in her spine from sleeping on the couch because she couldn't bear the emptiness of her bed, about how the tea tasted like cardboard now, and how her hands didn't feel like hers anymore. She paused with her finger hovering over send. The message was long, raw, and in a strange way, embarrassing. Not because of its honesty, but because of how little she expected in return. And then, after rereading it for the 3rd time, she deleted the words one by one and sent a laughing emoji instead. The reply came in less than a minute. LOL, you're up late. Nothing else. No question mark. No follow-up. Claire remembered staring at that tiny bubble of text until her screen dimmed itself into blackness. And somehow, that hurt more than silence would have. Because silence can be filled with hope, but indifference has edges. She never told anyone about that night. It became one of those quiet turning points, like when the first leaf falls in September, or when a favorite song suddenly feels too loud. Life didn't change overnight. There was no storm, no confrontation, just a slow recalibration of heartbeats. Claire stopped texting first. She stopped remembering birthdays. She let the group chat mute itself into oblivion. And no one noticed. Now, holding the old note in her hand again, she wondered why she had written it at all. Maybe she had hoped, foolishly, that someday someone would find it. Someone who cared enough to ask, "When did it get this bad?" But no one ever did. And that was the thing about people like Claire. They didn't ask for help. They left breadcrumbs, soft, careful signs in case someone came looking. But most people never do. Claire hadn't meant to find the thread. She was organizing the back room of the shop, trying to make space for a new donation of hardcovers, when she came across the old phone. It was tucked inside a scarf box, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed at the edges. She had switched phones a year ago and thought she'd wiped this one clean. But when she powered it up out of curiosity, the screen lit up slowly, sluggishly, like a memory resisting being brought back. It was there. Of course, the message, not the emoji, the real message. The one she had written but never sent. Her phone must have auto-saved it in the drafts folder, and somehow, in the quiet of that small back room, Claire found herself reading her own words as if they'd been written by someone else entirely. She could feel the woman who typed them, her hands cold, her back hunched over the kitchen table, her chest heavy with the kind of loneliness that doesn't ask for attention but still hopes, somewhere deep inside, that someone will notice. The tea. Words were raw. She had written about her mother's empty chair by the window, about how she still brewed 2 cups of tea out of habit. She'd written that she felt like she was underwater, watching the world happen above her, and no one realized she was drowning. The language was uneven, full of pauses and unfinished sentences, like a voice breaking in and out of a signal. But what struck Claire most wasn't the message itself. It was how easily she had hidden it. How quickly she had convinced herself it wasn't worth sending. That maybe her pain was too much, or not enough. And as she stood there in the middle of a room full of books about people brave enough to tell their stories, she realized she hadn't just been invisible to others. She had been invisible to herself. She had pushed everything so far down, covered it with routines and errands and polite smiles, that even she had forgotten how much it hurt. That was the twist. That was the truth that broke something open in her chest. It wasn't that Sam didn't care. It was that Claire had never given him the chance to. She had expected him to see through her silence, to understand the weight of a laugh at 2 a.m., to read between the lines of a one-word reply. And when he didn't, she told herself it meant he never really saw her. But people don't read between the lines unless they're told where to look. Sam wasn't cruel. He was just normal. Wrapped up in his own world, assuming Claire was strong, like she always had been, like she always pretended to be. And maybe that was the real tragedy. Not the silence, but how well she had trained everyone not to hear her. She sat on the floor of the back room, legs folded under her like a child, phone still lit in her palm. The air smelled faintly of dust and cardboard and something sweet, perhaps peppermint from a spilled tin nearby. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the responsible one, the dependable one, the good listener. She felt like a woman who had spent too long waiting for someone else to notice her sadness, as if it were their responsibility to care. And it wasn't just Sam. There were dozens of tiny moments she'd buried so neatly, she had forgotten they ever cut. The way a friend once changed the subject when Claire mentioned the funeral. The silence after she'd posted an old photo of her mother and received only a thumbs up. The time she cried in the car outside the grocery store and wiped her eyes before anyone could see. Pain had become a private language, and Claire had spoken it fluently, just not aloud. She opened the draft again and read it once more, this time not with shame, but with something close to mourning. For herself. For all the versions of her, who had needed comfort and got none. And just as she was about to close the phone, she noticed one last thing she had forgotten. There, below the message, was a second draft. A single-word message, sent 1 minute after she had deleted everything else. That was it. The laughing emoji. She remembered it now. How her thumb had hovered. How it felt safer than truth. How much easier it was to play along. And the worst part? Sam had replied with the same emoji. That tiny yellow face, eyes scrunched, mouth wide, a digital laugh, 2 people pretending at 2 a.m., neither of them brave enough to say what they really meant. How many times have you written everything? Only to delete it. If this feels like something you've lived through, stay with Claire a little longer. Claire once believed that being loved meant being needed. That to be the one people turned to in the dark, the one who knew where the extra blankets were kept, who remembered food allergies, who kept tissues in every room. That was enough. She believed for a long time that presence was purpose. So when Elise knocked on her door at 12:14 a.m. on a Thursday, eyes red and voice cracking, Claire didn't hesitate. She made chamomile tea, pulled the blanket from the armchair, and sat beside her while the story of another crumbling relationship spilled out in hiccuped sentences and half-whispers. Claire nodded, stroked her hair like a mother might, and said the same words she'd said 100 times before. You're not alone. But she was. No one ever came knocking on Claire's door when she broke. No one brought tea or quiet. No one held space for the way she unraveled in the middle of her kitchen at night, when the kettle clicked and the hum of the refrigerator was louder than her own breath. She thought of Jonah, the boy who worked part-time in her shop the summer before, graduate school. He lingered after hours, talking about his dissertation and his fear of not being enough. Claire had made room for him, literally. Cleared a corner of the back office where he could study, stocked the cabinet with granola bars and almond milk, lent him her copy of Letters to a Young Poet. When he left, he hugged her tight and said, "You feel like home." But he never called again, never sent a postcard, even though he promised. People didn't stay. Not because they didn't care, but because Claire made it too easy for them to leave. She had spent so long being strong that people mistook it for joy. They saw the open shop, the curated window displays, the wrapped books with hand-tied twine. They saw Claire in her thick cardigan with sleeves pushed to her elbows, hair pinned back, voice soft, composed, warm. They didn't see the unopened letters from the mortgage bank, the voicemail she couldn't bring herself to delete, the way her hands sometimes trembled when she tied a bow because her mother used to do the same, and now she couldn't remember the last thing her mother said. No one asked, because Claire didn't invite the question, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of the wound. There had been a dinner party once, years ago, hosted by a woman Claire barely knew anymore but couldn't quite call a stranger. They had met in Ella's kindergarten, bonded over packed lunches and playground complaints, and somehow stayed, tethered through years of polite messages and once-a-year coffees. That evening, the table was lit with soft candles and surrounded by couples who all seemed to laugh in sync. Claire had worn her nicest sweater. She had even brought wine, something local, something dry, something she couldn't afford. No one noticed. She remembered sitting across from a man who looked vaguely familiar and being asked, "So, do you live alone?" The way he said alone, as if it were an accident one should eventually recover from, made her throat tighten. She had smiled and replied, "Yes, it's quieter that way." He nodded, uninterested. The conversation drifted. After dessert, while coats were being collected and goodbye kisses offered at the door, Claire had lingered a moment too long, hoping someone might say, "Hey, stay. Let's talk. I miss your voice." But no one did. So she walked home in the cold, heels clicking against frozen pavement, rehearsing comebacks she never got the chance to deliver. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if she had ever said the truth. "Actually, I hate the quiet. Actually, I wish someone would ask if I've eaten dinner this week. Actually, I can't remember the last time someone hugged me without a reason." But she never did, because Claire had grown fluent in silence. She remembered a time, long before the bookshop, when she had a colleague named Marianne. They worked in a nonprofit together, planning community outreach and writing grant proposals late into the night. Marianne had once called Claire her emotional compass. But the day Claire showed up with red-rimmed eyes and shaking hands, her mother had been diagnosed that morning, Marianne looked up from her laptop and said, "Don't you dare cry. If you cry, I'll cry. And we don't have time for that." Claire didn't cry. She smiled, said she'd just gotten something in her eye. Then she excused herself to the restroom and sat on the closed toilet, counting the seconds between the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the beep of the printer outside the door. And when she came back, she offered to grab coffee for everyone. It was easier that way. People liked her more when she made things easier. One evening, close to closing time, a teenage girl wandered into the shop. Her face was pale beneath the glow of the fairy lights. Her sleeves tugged over her hands. She didn't speak at first, just circled the shelves like she was searching for something she wasn't sure existed. Claire watched from behind the counter, not pressing, not asking, just present. After 10 minutes, the girl approached. "Do you have something for people who feel tired?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire blinked. She didn't ask what kind of tired. She just led her to a shelf in the far corner, the one with the books that had held her on days when breathing felt like labor. She ran her fingers along the spines, Maggie O'Farrell, Cheryl Strayed, Ocean Vuong, and pulled out a thin paperback with a cracked cover. "This one's gentle," she said, "and true." The girl took the book in both hands like it was warm. She didn't smile, but she nodded. And when she left, she whispered, "Thanks for seeing me." Claire stood still long after the bell above the door had stilled. It had been so long since someone said that. So long since someone implied she could still witness softness and not just carry it for others. That night, she sat in the reading nook with a blanket over her knees and opened her notebook again. She didn't write a poem or a confession. She wrote a list, not of gratitude, not of resolutions, just a list of things no one ever asked her. What was the last thing that made you cry? Do you ever sleep through the night? Are there days you don't speak at all? Do you sometimes wish someone else would refill the sugar jar? Is there anyone left who says your name gently? When she looked at the list, she didn't cry. She just sat there, staring at her own handwriting like it belonged to someone she once loved and forgot to check in on. She remembered something Sam once told her, years ago. They had been sitting on her back porch, passing a bottle of cheap wine between them after his divorce papers came through. He'd said, "The worst part is not that she left. It's that for months she stopped looking at me. And I didn't even notice until I needed her to see me again." Claire hadn't understood it then, but she did now. It wasn't abandonment that haunted her. It was the invisibility that preceded it. The slow dimming of attention, the way people began to speak around her, through her, over her. Like she had become a space people pass through, not a person they return to. Even Ella had started sounding like someone else's daughter. Sweet, dutiful, distracted. Her calls came on schedule now, twice a week, 10 minutes each. Claire never mentioned the leaking faucet or the cold that had lingered for a month, or how she sometimes walked around the shop just to hear the floorboards creak so she'd know she was still real. Instead, she asked about midterms, about roommates, about the new scarf Ella had ordered online. Once she had almost said it, almost let it spill out in the space between "I miss you" and "take care." "I'm not okay." 3 words, that's all. But the moment had passed, like they always did. And so instead, Claire had said, "Don't forget your umbrella, it might rain." And Ella, lovely and young and trying so hard to be adult, had laughed and said, "Still the weather queen, huh, Mom?" Claire had smiled. After the call, she stood in the doorway of her apartment and listened to the stillness. Outside, it had already begun to rain. In the days that followed, the memory of that not-said truth lingered like the scent of perfume in a room long after someone has left. Claire began noticing the weight of all her unsentences, the almost asks, the half-reaches, the smiles that were stitched too tightly across skin stretched thin with tiredness, and it began to ache, not with sharpness, but with familiarity. Like an old sweater worn so often the sleeves grew thin, but you keep it anyway, because it still knows your shape. One evening, she reopened her old phone, the one she had charged months ago, with the draft she never sent. This time, she opened the draft not as a wound but as a mirror. She read her own words and whispered them aloud, quietly, as though confessing to the room, "I'm still here." But no one's asked, and this time, she didn't cry. She folded the phone shut. And for the first time in years, Claire did something she hadn't done since her mother passed. She walked out of the apartment, down the narrow stairs, and across the silent street. She didn't wear a coat, just a sweater and her boots. She walked past the post office, the bakery that closed at 5, the statue of the town's founder holding a book no one ever read, and she turned, finally, toward Sam's house. His porch light was on. She didn't plan to knock. She didn't expect him to answer. She just wanted to be outside of herself for a moment, to stand where someone might see her, really see her, even if only in silhouette. She stood at the edge of his walkway for a long time. Then quietly, she whispered toward the porch, "I'm not okay." It wasn't for him. It was for her. And somewhere, far inside her chest, a door she hadn't dared touch in years finally clicked open. Sometimes, it only takes one stranger to notice what the people closest to us missed. If this moment stayed, With you, maybe it's time we looked around a little more carefully. Maybe someone we know is quietly waiting to be seen. The next morning, Claire woke early. There was no dramatic sunrise, no epiphany waiting in the steam of her tea. Only a dull ache behind her eyes and the sound of wind scratching at the windows. But something was different. Subtle. A shift she couldn't name yet. She dressed slowly, chose a sweater her mother once knitted, and tied her hair in the lazy braid she used to wear in her 20s. It felt like armor. Downstairs, the shop was still. She opened the blinds, turned the sign to open, and sat behind the counter without turning on the lights. The silence felt earned now. It didn't press against her chest the way it used to. She reached for the drawer where the old letters were. The ones she had started over the years. Unsent words for Sam, for Ella, for her sister, for her mother. Claire never meant to keep them. But she never meant to throw them away either. They were the in-betweens of her life. The places where truth waited, quietly folded. She picked one at random. The handwriting told her it was from the year after the divorce. Dear Sam, do you remember the night you came over drunk, heartbroken, and we sat on my porch until the birds started? You cried about missing your kids. You told me I was the only person you could be honest with. I made you toast, and you fell asleep on my couch with your shoes still on. You said I saved you that night. But you never asked how I was surviving. You never asked why I couldn't sleep either, why my eyes were red before you even knocked. You never saw me, Sam. You saw what you needed. Someone still standing. She folded it back up. She didn't need to read more. Not today. The truth had been there all along. Sam hadn't betrayed her. He hadn't abandoned her. He had simply accepted the version of Claire that she had presented, strong, steady, whole. He believed her smiles. He trusted her quiet, and that somehow was the heartbreak. Not that he didn't care, but that he believed she didn't need to be cared for. The next morning, Claire woke early. There was no dramatic sunrise, no epiphany waiting in the steam of her tea. Only a dull ache behind her eyes and the sound of wind scratching at the windows. But something was different, subtle. A shift she couldn't name yet. She dressed slowly, chose a sweater her mother once knitted, and tied her hair in the lazy braid she used to wear in her 20s. It felt like armor. Downstairs, the shop was still. She opened the blinds, turned the sign to open, and sat behind the counter without turning on the lights. The silence felt earned now. It didn't press against her chest the way it used to. She reached for the drawer where the old letters were. The ones she had started over the years. Unsent words for Sam, for Ella, for her sister, for her mother. Claire never meant to keep them. But she never meant to throw them away either. They were the in-betweens of her life. The places where truth waited, quietly folded. She picked one at random. The handwriting told her it was from the year after the divorce. Dear Sam, do you remember the night you came over drunk, heartbroken, and we sat on my porch until the birds started? You cried about missing your kids. You told me I was the only person you could be honest with. I made you toast, and you fell asleep on my couch with your shoes still on. You said I saved you that night. But you never asked how I was surviving. You never asked why I couldn't sleep either, why my eyes were red before you even knocked. You never saw me, Sam. You saw what you needed. Someone still standing. She folded it back up. She didn't need to read more. Not today. The truth had been there all along. Sam hadn't betrayed her. He hadn't abandoned her. He had simply accepted the version of Claire that she had presented, strong, steady, whole. He believed her smiles. He trusted her quiet, and that somehow was the heartbreak. Not that he didn't care, but that he believed she didn't need to be cared for. She closed the drawer slowly, as if folding the past into itself. Outside, the wind picked up. The kind of wind that carried old leaves and the scent of something distant. Wood smoke, maybe, or rain that hadn't yet arrived. Claire looked around the shop. Every corner felt like a mirror now. The worn armchair by the mystery section, the chipped mug on the counter, the shelf of poetry no one ever touched unless she recommended something. It was all her, bits of her scattered through curated comfort. But none of it had ever been enough to fill the space of being unseen. And then something happened, small, nearly unremarkable. But in that quiet moment, everything shifted. The bell above the door rang. She looked up and saw Sam. He stood in the doorway, hands in the pockets of his coat, hair damp from the wind, eyes uncertain. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from lack of sleep, but the kind that came from carrying too much for too long. "I was walking," he said. Like that explained it all. Claire nodded. "Do you want coffee?" He hesitated, then stepped inside. "Only if it's terrible and too strong." She smiled, a real one this time, tired, crooked, unguarded. As the coffee brewed, neither of them spoke. Sam walked the shop like a man seeing it for the first time, even though he'd been there 100 times before. He picked up a book, turned it over, put it back. Finally, as Claire handed him the chipped mug, he said, "You used to tell me everything. And then one day, you stopped." Claire looked down. "I didn't think it mattered." He didn't answer right away. Just held the cup between his palms like it could anchor him. "It did," he said quietly. "I just didn't know how to ask." Claire felt something loosen in her chest. She sat down across from him. "I thought if I made it easy for everyone, they'd stay." "You made it easy to forget you were human." The words weren't cruel. They were simply true. They sat in silence, the kind that wasn't heavy this time, just full. And for the first time in years, Claire allowed herself to say what she'd never said before. "I'm not okay, Sam." And he didn't rush to fix it. He didn't offer platitudes or stories of people who had it worse. He just nodded, his eyes glassy. "Okay," he whispered. "Then I'll stay, even if I don't know what to do." That was enough. Not because it solved anything, but because it broke the rule Claire had built her life around. That pain must be invisible to be bearable. Later, when he had gone, and the shop had returned to its hush, Claire sat alone with the empty mugs. She didn't clean them, just stared at them and whispered, to no one in particular, "Thank you for asking." If you've ever said "I'm fine" when you were anything but, maybe it's time to let someone in. Just one person. Just one quiet truth. Because sometimes, that's where the healing begins. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was restless, but because something in her had finally settled, and the quiet that followed felt too unfamiliar to fall asleep in. Her body didn't ache the way it used to when she carried too much and spoke too little. Instead, she sat by the window with her knees to her chest and let the dark wrap around her like an old shawl. Across the street, Sam's porch light was still on. Maybe he was pacing, maybe he wasn't. But he had heard her. That much she knew. She traced her name in the condensation on the glass. Claire. The name people said in passing, in greetings, in group emails and receipts. But when was the last time someone had said it slowly? Like it mattered. Like it meant someone was choosing her in that moment, even just to ask a real question. She remembered how her mother used to say her name when she was little, when she was scared of thunder or had a fever. Claire. Just that. Like a whole sentence, tucked inside a single word. A kind of music. And it hit her, so quietly she didn't even notice the tear until it touched her knuckle. She missed being loved out loud, not in declarations or big gestures, but in the little ways that meant someone saw the weight she carried and offered to hold the edge of it. Even for a second, she thought about every moment she had dimmed herself to stay likable, Every joke she had made to deflect emotion. Every time she said, "I'm okay," with a smile so tight her jaw hurt afterward. She thought about the people who told her she was strong when what she needed was softness. About how no one had ever taught her that "I need you" wasn't a weakness, but a kind of bravery. She rose before dawn. The shop was still cloaked, in half light. She didn't open the blinds, didn't start the kettle. Instead, she walked to the shelf by the door and pulled out her own notebook, the one with fragments of who she'd been scribbled in pencil, some lines so faint she had to squint to read them, and she began a new page. Things I will no longer apologize for. Wanting to be heard, wanting to be held, saying I can't do it today, saying I need help, saying nothing at all, and at the bottom she wrote, "Love doesn't require me to be small, not anymore." She tore the page clean, folded it twice, and tucked it behind the cash register where she kept spare bookmarks. She wasn't sure why, maybe for herself, maybe for the next girl who wandered in asking for a book that understood tiredness. That afternoon, Claire did something she hadn't done in nearly a decade. She closed the shop early. There was no emergency, no excuse. She simply turned the sign to "Sorry, back tomorrow," locked the door, and let the silence follow her up the stairs to the apartment. Not the silence of routine or of being forgotten, but a new kind, chosen, claimed. She opened her closet and stood before it for a while, letting her eyes move over the neat rows of gray, navy, and oatmeal sweaters, clothes that made her small, soft-spoken, appropriate. Garments of a woman who had never taken up more space than she was given. She reached to the back and pulled out a red coat. A bold, structured thing her mother had given her when she turned 40. "So they remember you've arrived," her mother had said with a wink. Claire had never worn it. Not once. She tried it on. It was a little snug at the shoulders, the sleeves, slightly long, but it was warm. And when she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, she startled. Not because she looked strange, but because she looked visible. For the first time in years, she didn't see someone who disappeared into the corners of her life. She saw a woman learning to return to herself. She stepped outside, the red coat vivid against the silver blue of late afternoon. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't need to. Her feet moved instinctively toward the lake at the edge of town, where the air was always colder and the world felt a little quieter, like it could finally hear her think. She walked slowly, the way one walks toward something sacred. And somewhere, in the wind, as the sun began to bleed into the clouds, Claire whispered, not to Sam, not to Ella, not to the friend who never asked if she was okay, but to herself. "You matter, even when no one's watching." And for once, it didn't feel like a hope. It felt like the beginning of a truth. The shop was quiet again. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came after customers left or the kind she'd grown used to through the seasons. This was the kind of stillness that settled deep in the bones, a silence that didn't just surround her, but seemed to echo from inside. Claire sat at her desk with the lights off. Outside, the snow had begun to fall. Soft, weightless flakes, drifting like ash. The kettle had boiled 20 minutes ago. She hadn't poured the water. The cup still sat beside her, a curled wisp of steam long gone. On the wall, the clock ticked, steady, unforgiving. She glanced at her phone. No new messages. Ella hadn't called. Not that she was supposed to. Not that anyone was. Still, she stared at the screen like it might flicker with something. An apology, a check-in, a question, anything. She hadn't told Ella about the coat, or about Sam, or about the note tucked behind the cash register. She hadn't told anyone that she had closed the shop early 2 days in a row, or that she couldn't remember the last full night of sleep. Or that last Thursday, she had walked to the lake and stood at the edge for an hour, not thinking of jumping, never that. but wondering how it would feel to disappear just for a little while. Not permanently, just long enough to see if anyone noticed. It terrified her how soothing that idea felt. That was the Bekeech. Not that no one loved her, but that she had become so easy to live without. There had been a moment, years ago, when she almost told her sister. They were cleaning out their parents' house after their father passed. Dusty shelves, old picture frames, the smell of paper, and lemon oil. Claire had picked up a photo of them as girls, matching dresses, bruised knees, wide grins, and said, almost without thinking, "Do you ever feel like you disappeared from your own life?" Margaret had barely paused. "No, I just moved forward," and Claire had smiled. Of course she did. After that, she never asked again. Because if you say you're lonely and the answer is silence, it's a silence you never forget. That night, she dreamt of her mother, not as she'd been near the end, frail and slow, but younger, humming while folding laundry, her hands quick and certain, her voice steady. In the dream, Claire stood at the edge of the kitchen table, holding a glass of milk, watching her mother wrap a scarf around her neck. "You're not warm enough," her mother said without looking. "Say something when you're cold, Claire." But in the dream, Claire couldn't speak. Her mouth opened and no words came. Only the sound of the ticking kitchen clock. Only silence. And her mother, without turning, added gently, "People won't know unless you tell them." When she woke, her pillow was damp. She lay there for a long time, tracing the shape of that sentence in her mind. People won't know unless you tell them. The truth settled in like snow on the roof, quiet, certain, absolute. So much of what she'd lost wasn't taken from her. It had been left behind, and she had been the one to leave it. All those moments when she could have said, "I'm tired. I'm scared. I need someone." And instead, she smiled, offered tea, made space for other people's stories, even Sam, especially Sam. It wasn't that he never asked. It was that by the time he might have, she had already closed the door. And Ella. God, Ella. Her daughter had inherited that same careful silence. She never pushed, never pried. Claire had taught her that. Taught her to be self-sufficient, to handle heartbreak with books and baths and long walks instead of confession. She wondered now how many times Ella had sat on the other end of the phone, waiting for her mother to let her in. Wondering if she should ask more. Wondering if asking would make anything worse. Claire hadn't meant to pass down her loneliness. But she had. She sat at the edge of the bed and whispered into the room, "I'm sorry." Not to anyone in particular, just to the echo of every version of herself that had curled up and stayed quiet when she should have said something. She spent that day in the shop but didn't open it. Instead, she moved slowly between the shelves, wiping dust from forgotten corners, pressing her hand to spines she hadn't touched in years. She found an old receipt tucked into a cookbook from a night she and Ella had made pumpkin bread and burned it. Claire had written, "Fail but fun," in the margin. She smiled, then cried, then laughed. By late afternoon, she was sitting at the front desk with a candle lit beside her, the windows catching the golden hour in streaks of pink and soft orange, and then, without knowing why, she picked up her phone. She didn't call Sam. She called Ella. It rang once, twice. "Mom?" Her voice came through, a little breathless. "Is everything okay?" Claire didn't answer right away. She let the pause stretch, and then softly she said, "No, not really." And Ella, sweet, steady Ella, said nothing, just stayed on the line. Claire could hear her breathing, and for the first time, that was enough. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Claire could hear Ella shifting, maybe lying down, maybe curling into herself the way she did as a child when words felt too big. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was full, like a blanket pulled up to the chin on a cold day. She imagined her daughter in a tiny dorm room or a too-bright apartment, hearing her mother's voice break just slightly and realizing, maybe for the first time, that she was allowed to be the strong one now. Claire didn't explain. Didn't list the things that had gone wrong or how long she had been pretending. She didn't talk about the code or the lake or how tired she still felt even after sleeping. All she said, finally, was, "I just needed to say it once." Ella's reply was barely a whisper. "You can say it more than once, you know." And that, somehow, broke her more gently than anything else ever could. She didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she leaned her forehead against the window pane and closed her eyes, letting the cold seep in. Somewhere in the town, a church bell rang. She'd never noticed it before. Or maybe she had, only now it was ringing for her too. After they hung up, she didn't rush to do anything. She didn't clean or write or plan. She sat with the silence again. But this time it was different. It didn't swallow her. It held her. Because now, someone else knew. She was no longer the only keeper of her own sadness. And in that fragile, quiet knowing, something inside her finally exhaled. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, just after Claire had refilled the candy jar and unlocked the shop. A small envelope, pale blue, tucked between bills and catalogs. No return address, no stamp. Just her name, written in soft, round letters that looked vaguely familiar. Not the kind of handwriting that jumps out, but the kind that lingers in memory like a childhood tune. Claire almost tossed it aside. But something stopped her. She opened it slowly. The paper worn soft at the folds. Inside was a single sheet. No greeting. No date. Just a few lines in that same rounded hand. "I came in once, years ago. You didn't know me. I was falling apart quietly. You gave me tea and a book I still keep by my bed. You told me I didn't have to smile if it hurt. I never said thank you, but I saw you. I remember your eyes. I hope someone is doing for you what you did for me." Claire sat down. For a long time, she didn't move. The letter trembled in her hand. Not because it was shocking, but because it was the first time in so long that something uninvited had arrived just to say, "You mattered." She tried to remember who it could have been. There had been so many faces, so many quiet exchanges over the years. People who stayed 5 minutes or 50. People who came to find a book and left with something more. She didn't need to know the name. That wasn't the point. What mattered was that even in her invisibility, someone had noticed. Someone had carried her presence forward in their life, all. Those days when Claire had doubted whether she left any mark at all, whether her silence had erased her completely. This letter said otherwise. It said, "You were seen. Even when you weren't speaking." Claire placed the letter on the counter beside the register, smoothed its creases with the back of her hand, and sat still long enough for the world to shift around her. The heater clicked on. A car passed outside, slow against the snow. A boy and his father stopped to look at the window display. "Books for cold hands and warm hearts." She'd written that herself on a chalkboard sign last week. For the first time, she read it, again, and smiled like it belonged to her. She didn't tell Sam about the letter. She didn't even tell Ella. It wasn't a secret, but something gentler. Something sacred. It didn't need to be passed around to become real. It had already done its work. She spent the rest of the day moving differently. Not faster, not louder, just more present. When Mrs. Delaney came in, Claire asked how her arthritis was, not out of habit, but because she wanted to know. When a teenager wandered through the poetry aisle and left with nothing, Claire slipped a folded note in the back of a free chapbook and placed it on the shelf where she'd seen her pause. "It's okay not to say everything, but I hope you say something. Someday." She didn't sign it. Didn't need to. Because that's what the letter had taught her. That sometimes we're not meant to be the ones who receive the applause. Sometimes we're the breath that steadies someone else. And sometimes, in return, the world surprises us with a kindness we planted long ago and forgot to water. That night, she didn't open her notebook. She didn't light a candle. She didn't search for meaning in the dark. She made soup. She put on music. She called Ella, and they talked about nothing in particular. Claire listened to her daughter laugh and didn't rush to fill the silence after. She let it sit there, like a warm coat over their shoulders, and before bed, she placed the letter in the drawer where she kept her tea bags. Not because it needed to be hidden, but because she wanted it close. Quiet, still. A reminder that even the smallest light, left behind without announcement, could find its way back to the dark. The next morning, Claire found another note. It wasn't a letter, just a scribbled sentence in the corner of a torn receipt, left between the pages of a book someone had returned. No name, no explanation. It said, "I left this here because I wasn't ready to carry it yet. But now, maybe, I am." She held the paper for a long time, her thumb brushing over the ink like it could tell her more. The handwriting wasn't familiar. The message wasn't even clearly addressed, but she understood it, deeply, as if it had been written by a version of herself from years ago, waiting in the quiet for someone to pick it up. Claire tucked the note into the back of the register drawer, next to the blue envelope from earlier that week. She didn't cry. She didn't even smile. She just breathed, slow and full. Because for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like a question unanswered. She felt like a pause someone had decided to stay within. Later, a woman came into the shop, young, tired, with circles beneath her eyes and a scarf too thin for the weather. She wandered toward the poetry shelf, ran her fingers across a title, and looked up at Claire, hesitant. "Do you have something for when you're not sure if you're okay?" Claire nodded. She didn't speak. She simply reached behind the counter, into the drawer, and handed her the letter. Spring didn't come all at once. It crept in shyly, one thawed patch of sidewalk at a time, one longer afternoon, one softer breeze. Claire noticed it not by the calendar, but by the change in light on the floor of her bookshop. The way it shifted slowly, from cold gray to something closer to honey. The shop was still quiet most days. Maple Falls didn't suddenly become bustling, and Claire didn't suddenly become someone different. But she moved differently now, not because she had become bold or fearless, but because she had stopped disappearing. She began leaving the lights on longer in the evenings, not for the customers, but for herself. Because there was something comforting about knowing the shop glowed like a lighthouse, even if no one stepped inside. Sam came by sometimes, not with grand gestures or heavy words, but with small things. A pastry, a new novel. Once, a thermos. Of her favorite tea and a note. "I'm still learning how to ask, but I'm here." They didn't talk about the night she'd said, "I'm not okay." They didn't have to. Some truths once spoken keep echoing, softly, gently, in every silence that follows. Claire didn't reopen everything. There were still parts of herself she kept behind locked drawers and carefully labeled boxes, but she had started sharing the margins, and sometimes that was enough. Ella visited over spring break. She brought mismatched socks and a chipped mug from her campus apartment, and they sat in the back room surrounded by unopened boxes Claire had meant to sort for months. They didn't open them, they just talked. Not about healing, not about pain, just life, groceries, books. A boy Ella might like but isn't sure how to talk to. And when Ella hugged her before leaving, she didn't say, "Take care." She said, "Tell me when it's hard." That Sunday, Claire opened the shop a little earlier than usual. Not because she expected anyone, but because the morning light felt like something worth sitting in. She brewed tea and opened the window just enough to let in the scent of thawing earth and the sound of birds that hadn't been heard in months. She played a record, one her mother used to love, and let it crackle through the quiet, filling the spaces she no longer needed to hide in. The bell above the door rang a few times that day. Customers wandered in. A child asked for a book about bears. A teenager bought a blank journal. An older man asked if she had anything about second chances. Claire gave him a copy of The Unlikely, Pilgrimage of Harold Fry. By mid-afternoon, the light had shifted again. It poured across the wooden floor in long golden stripes, the kind that made everything look like memory. She sat down behind the counter and opened the notebook she once feared, the one filled with pages she hadn't dared to reread. But today she didn't feel afraid. She flipped to the very first page, the one that simply read, "I'm still here, but no one's asked." And underneath it, in her own handwriting, she wrote, "I asked. That counts too." She closed the notebook gently. Before she left that night. She turned off the front lights but left the lamp in the poetry corner on, a soft pool of amber behind the glass. Just enough for someone walking past to know there's still someone inside. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She walked to the front door, turned the sign around slowly, and wrote a note in chalk under the hours. "Come in. You don't have to smile." And as she stepped back to look at it, no one watching, no applause, she felt something settle in her chest. Not certainty, not even peace, just a quiet knowing. She hadn't vanished. She had returned. One small truth at a time,